Hey everybody, Matt here. Thanks for stopping by. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I added a second suspended shelf. Just like last time, I'm using the miter saw to cut the pieces of wood that are going to be used to clamp the shelf into position. Last time I used a drill press to drill the holes. This time I thought I'd just use a hand drill with a slightly oversized drill bit. At my local Home Depot, I bought some 36-inch long threaded rod, 3/8 by 16. By using a tape measure, I determined that I didn't need to shorten the 36-inch rods at all. It took me some time to determine the easiest way for me to exchange the 18-inch long rods for the full 36-inch, so let me demonstrate what I wound up doing using the next shelf over. I started by installing a couple of lengths of 1/4-20 threaded rod in the upper I-beam clamps. With the 1/4-20 nuts tight, now I can loosen the 3/8 nuts on the longer rods and know that the I-beam clamp isn't going to fall apart. Now I can use the bottom nut on the longer 3/8 rod to pull out the rod. I just tighten the nut and it'll gradually pull out the rod. There's 16 threads per inch, so every 16 full revolutions of the nut moves the rod down an inch. And since the top part of the rod goes through two 2x4s turned on side, 2x4 is 1.5 inches, so two of those is 3 inches, and there's a 1/4 inch spacer between the 2x4s, so I have to pull the rod down about 3¼ inches before it's free of the I-beam clamps. You can see in this clip that I've had to spin the nuts up on the rod as the rod gets pulled down through the 2x4s. I did think about stopping and trying to make a tool that would maybe fit into my battery-powered drill to help me spin those nuts, but I figured that was too much of a distraction. I just kept going manually. At this point you can see that that first rod is not coming out very easily, so I chose to loosen some more of the 3/8 nuts on the adjacent rods, just trying to loosen up the whole clamp for the shelf and hopefully get that first rod out a little bit easier. I decided to do it this way because I didn't want to take down the whole first shelf. I just wanted to exchange the rods without disturbing the shelf that's already there. Alright, finally got that rod out. Alright, now to install the 36-inch rod, it's basically just the total opposite process. I'm going to start by threading on the bottom nut and a lock washer and then a flat washer, and then pushing it through the two pieces of wood that are used to clamp the shelf. Once the rod is through, then I can put another flat washer, lock washer, and another nut. Next, I can put another nut on, a lock washer, and another flat washer. Push the rod through the 2x4s that are clamped to the I-beam. Once the rod comes out of the top 2x4, then I can put another flat washer, lock washer, and spin up another nut. At a certain point here, it became too difficult to continue to push the threaded rod through the holes in the 2x4s. So what I found I needed to do was actually just spin the rod or kind of thread it up through the holes to get the rod to the right height. Once it looked like the rod was at about the right height, I'd step off the ladder and just double check it. Did this a couple of times, finally got it the right height. Once all 6 of the long threaded rods were in place, then it was on to actually installing the shelf. So I'd start by threading on the nut and then putting a lock washer and a flat washer, and then I'd use a piece of masking tape just to keep the washers up and out of the way. Next, I'd push on the upper piece of wood over the threaded rods. If it didn't stay by itself, just by friction, I'd use a small clamp on the center rod just to keep that up and out of the way and not falling off the rods. With that done on both sides, then it's time to lift the metal shelf into place. This was kind of tricky because the shelf is a little bit heavy and kind of awkward, but once it's in place over the rods, then I used a large flat washer and a nut over each one of the center rods just to keep the shelf up and from falling off the rods. So once the shelf is on there temporarily, then I can hold it with one hand, remove the nut from the center rod that's holding the shelf up, put the nut down, pick up the lower piece of wood, press that over the rods, and then hopefully that stays just by friction. If not, use the hand that's holding up the shelf to also hold up the piece of wood and hold up the shelf, and then reinstall the nut just to keep the wood, the shelf, and all in place. Once this is done to both sides, so now the shelf and the lower pieces of wood are loosely in place, now I can install the other washers and other nuts, and again, everything is very loose but not falling apart. Once the shelf is in place and all the nuts and washers are in place, albeit loosely, then I can retighten the 3/8 nuts up at the I-beam clamp. Then I can loosen and remove the 1/4 threaded rod. Now I'm ready to tighten all the rest of the nuts. Once all the nuts were tight and both shelves looked like by eye they were reasonably level, I did throw a 4-foot level up on each shelf and wound up making some adjustments. But eventually I got both shelves to be reasonably level. So here's a shot of the 2 shelves suspended from the one section of the I-beam. These shelves have really worked out really well. It's really nice to have the floor space free underneath the shelf.